April 21, 1945. Late afternoon. A forest near Duber, Germany. Field Marshal Walter Model walks slowly through the ancient oaks, his adjutant, Colonel Theodore Pilling, following a few paces behind. The sounds of distant artillery echo across the shattered landscape of the Ruhr industrial heartland. American forces are everywhere now. The pocket has collapsed. More than 300,000 German soldiers are surrendering or already sitting in makeshift prisoner of war enclosures. The greatest industrial region in Germany lies in ruins, its factories silent and its cities burning. Model stops in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. He removes his monocle and polishes it carefully, a habit formed over decades of command. His uniform is still immaculate despite days of evading Allied patrols through this devastated landscape. He is 54 years old. He has commanded more German soldiers than any other field marshal in the final years of the war. He has been called Hitler's Fireman for his ability to rescue collapsing fronts from seemingly certain catastrophe. He has stabilized the Eastern Front when it threatened to disintegrate completely. He has stopped the Allied advance at Arnhem when victory seemed within their grasp. Now there is nothing left to rescue, nothing left to stabilize, nothing left to command. He turns to Pilling. His voice is quiet, almost philosophical, stripped of the fury that his staff officers had learned to fear. What is left to a commander in defeat? In antiquity, they took poison. 6 days earlier, Model had done something unprecedented in the history of the German military. Rather than obey Hitler's orders to fight to the last man in what the Führer called Fortress Ruhr, rather than surrender his army group formally to the Americans, he had simply dissolved it with a single order. He released the youngest and oldest soldiers from military service entirely. He told the rest they were free to surrender individually or attempt to escape through the Allied lines or on their own initiative. He erased Army Group B from existence, sparing hundreds of thousands of men from a pointless death in the final days of a war that had already been lost. Now he stands in this forest, having made his final decision. The Soviets have indicted him for war crimes, accusing him of responsibility for the deaths of hundreds of thousands in concentration camps in Latvia and the deportation of even more as slave labor. He knows what awaits him if the Americans turn him over to Soviet custody: a show trial in Moscow, a public hanging, his name dragged through accusations he cannot defend against because the Reich that created the records is burning around him. Model draws his pistol from its holster and checks that it is loaded. He looks at Pilling one last time. "You will bury me here," he says simply. Then Field Marshal Walter Model, the man who defied Hitler's final order to save the soldiers under his command, ends his life with a single shot to the head. His body will remain in this unmarked forest grave for 10 years before his son recovers it and gives him a proper military burial. But his decision to dissolve rather than sacrifice his army will echo through military history as one of the most remarkable acts of independent command judgment in the Second World War. It was not surrender. It was not defiance in any obvious sense. It was something stranger and more complicated, an erasure that accomplished what surrender would have accomplished while maintaining what Model considered his honor as a German officer. Otto Moritz Walter Model was born on January 24, 1891, in the small town of Genthin in the Prussian province of Saxony. The town sat along the Elbe-Havel Canal, a modest community of modest means, far from the centers of German power and prestige. His father, Otto Paul Moritz Model, taught music at a local girls' school. His mother, Marie Pauline Wilhelmina Dima, raised Walter and his older brother Otto in a comfortable but unremarkable middle-class household. The Model family had no military tradition whatsoever. In an era when the German officer corps was dominated by Prussian aristocrats whose families had served the crown for generations, when names like von Manstein and von Rundstedt carried the weight of centuries of military service, Walter Model came from thoroughly bourgeois stock. His father was a music teacher, not a baron or a count. There were no family estates with portraits of ancestors in uniform, no hereditary connections to famous regiments, no inherited titles or social standing to smooth his path into the highest ranks of German military society. This background would mark Model throughout his career in ways both obvious and subtle. He never quite fit the mold of the proper Prussian officer, with his impeccable manners, his aristocratic bearing, his careful observance of the social protocols that governed relations among the German military elite. Model was shorter than most of his peers, stocky and powerfully built rather than tall and elegant, with a direct manner of speaking that bordered on rudeness even when addressing superiors. He wore a monocle in his right eye, but on him it looked less like an aristocratic affectation and more like a practical tool for examining maps and orders. He was blunt where others were diplomatic, aggressive where others were cautious, and utterly unconcerned with the social niceties that his better-born colleagues considered essential. When he disagreed with an order, he said it loudly and profanely. When he found incompetence in his subordinates, he screamed at them in front of their men. His staff officers found him nearly impossible to work with. Several times during his career, entire staff sections requested transfers rather than continue serving under his brutal leadership style. The family moved from Genthin to Erfurt around 1900, then later to Nuremberg, where young Walter Model completed his secondary education at the Dom Gymnasium, a humanities-focused school that trained students in classical languages and literature. He graduated with his Abitur, the German secondary school certificate, at Easter 1909. That same year, he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Despite having no family military connections, no aristocratic sponsors, no obvious path to success in the rigidly hierarchical world of the Imperial German Army, Walter Model enrolled in an officer training academy. He joined the 52nd Infantry Regiment as a Fahrenjunker, the lowest officer cadet rank, and began the training that would transform a music teacher's son from a provincial town into one of the most decorated German generals of 2 world wars. By August 1910, he had earned his commission as a lieutenant. He was 19 years old, an officer in the Imperial German Army, about to enter a century that would demand everything he had to give and take nearly everything in return. When war came in August 1914, Model's regiment was deployed to the Western Front as part of the 5th Infantry Division. The initial German advance through Belgium and into France brought expectations of a quick and glorious victory. Those expectations died in the autumn mud along the Marne River as the war of rapid movement became a war of trenches, barbed wire, and artillery barrages that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Model served as adjutant of his regiment's 1st Battalion through the first brutal months of fighting. He experienced the transformation of warfare from something his training had prepared him for into something new and horrifying.
Machine guns turned infantry assaults into suicide charges. Artillery could destroy entire battalions in their trenches before they even saw the enemy. Gas drifted across no man's land, choking men who could not find their masks in time. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas dragged on through 1915, with no end in sight. In May 1915, near the French city of Arras, during one of the endless small-scale actions that characterized trench warfare, a bullet struck Model's shoulder blade. The wound was serious, barely missing the major artery that would have killed him within minutes. He spent a month in hospital recovering, plenty of time to reflect on what he had seen and experienced. The wound taught him something important about his own nature. He had been in the places where men died, and he had not flinched. He had discovered that he possessed physical courage in abundance, a willingness to put himself in danger that would become legendary among his troops in the next war. After recovering, Model returned to his unit and continued fighting. In September 1915, during intense combat around Butte des Aours in the Champagne region, he distinguished himself sufficiently that on October 19th he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, one of Germany's highest decorations for bravery in combat. His divisional commander, despite privately expressing misgivings about this uncomfortable subordinate who spoke his mind regardless of consequences, recommended Model for posting to the German General Staff. This recommendation changed everything about Model's career trajectory. The General Staff was the brain of the German military, the elite institution that planned and coordinated operations across all fronts, that trained the officers who would command armies and army groups. Assignment to the General Staff meant Model had been recognized as someone with exceptional potential, someone whose abilities outweighed his difficult personality. It also meant he would spend much of the remainder of the war in staff positions, rather than leading men directly in combat. He missed the worst of the subsequent slaughter, including the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where his division fought without him and suffered catastrophic casualties. Model sailed through the abbreviated wartime staff officer course and returned to the 5th Division as adjutant of the 10th Infantry Brigade. He held various positions through the remainder of the war, including company command in both the 52nd Infantry and the 8th Life Grenadiers. In 1916, he was wounded again, a complicated leg wound that required months of hospital time in Karlsruhe. By the spring of 1918, he had recovered and was serving as a staff officer in a Guards division during Operation Michael, the great German spring offensive that nearly broke the Allied lines before finally exhausting itself in June. The war ended with Germany's defeat in November 1918. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. Revolution swept the country as sailors mutinied and workers took to the streets. The mighty German army that had fought the combined forces of France, Britain, Russia, and eventually the United States to a 4-year standstill was reduced by the Treaty of Versailles to a token force of 100,000 men. Thousands of officers found themselves suddenly unemployed, their careers over before they had truly begun, their futures destroyed by defeat. Model was not among the discarded. His performance during the war, his general staff credentials, his evident abilities, and the connections he had made among fellow officers earned him a place in the Reichswehr, the small professional army allowed to Germany under the humiliating terms of the peace treaty. He was one of only 4,000 officers retained out of the tens of thousands who had served. For the next decade and a half, he served in various staff and command positions, building his expertise in tactics and military technology, rising slowly but steadily through the ranks of an army that was forbidden to grow, but that quietly prepared for the day when it would fight again. He married Hertha Huen in 1921, establishing the stable family life that would anchor him through the decades of conflict ahead. They would have 3 children together, including a son named Hans Horg, who would later become a general in the post-war German Bundeswehr. Model was a devoted family man by all accounts, though his career always came first in an army where personal connections and relationships mattered enormously for advancement. He cultivated friendships with rising officers who would later become key figures in the Wehrmacht, including men who would fight alongside him and against him in the internal politics of the German High Command. Through the 1920s and early 30s, Model served in increasingly important positions. He was assigned to the 3rd Infantry Division, considered one of the best units in the small German army, where he developed his understanding of modern warfare. He studied the new theories of armored warfare that were revolutionizing military thinking. He observed the political changes sweeping Germany as the Weimar Republic stumbled from crisis to crisis. By 1934, he had reached the rank of colonel. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933 and began the process of rearming Germany in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, Model was well positioned to benefit from the expansion of the military. Like many German officers of his generation, he saw in Hitler's program of rearmament and national revival an opportunity for the careers that the treaty had denied them for 15 years. Whether he genuinely embraced National Socialist ideology or simply accepted it as the price of military advancement remains debated by historians to this day. What is certain is that he did not resist it. He went along with the new regime, accepting its benefits while looking away from its crimes. By March 1938, Model had reached the rank of Major General. War came again in September 1939, and Model served as Chief of Staff of the 4th Corps during the invasion of Poland. He watched as the campaign proceeded with stunning speed, the new tactics of armored warfare shattering Polish defenses in mere weeks. He studied these methods carefully, understanding that the future of warfare belonged to tanks and aircraft and speed.
During the invasion of France in May 1940, Model served as Chief of Staff of the 16th Army under General Ernst Busch. The Army's role was to protect the flank of the main German thrust through the Ardennes forest. Model spent much of his time managing the complex logistics required for the rapid advance, watching as German armor sliced through France in a campaign that stunned the world and established Germany's military dominance over Western Europe. Then came the assignment that would transform him from a capable staff officer into one of Germany's most famous field commanders. In November 1940, Model received command of the 3rd Panzer Division, a veteran armored unit that was preparing for the largest military operation in history. It was his first troop command since the previous war, his first opportunity to prove himself as a combat leader rather than a staff planner. He was determined to make the most of it. He immediately set about preparing his division for what everyone in the German military knew was coming: the invasion of the Soviet Union, the fulfillment of Hitler's long-stated goal of conquering living space in the East. Model instituted combined arms training programs that were innovative for their time. Throwing tankers together with infantry, engineers with reconnaissance units, and signalers with artillery observers. His men trained in mixed formations called Kampfgruppen, battle groups that could operate independently and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances on the battlefield. This tactical flexibility would later become standard practice throughout the Wehrmacht, but in late 1940 and early 1941, it was still unusual enough to mark Model as a forward-thinking commander. Model also revealed the leadership style that would define his career for the remainder of the war. He was everywhere at once, visiting every unit, inspecting every vehicle, demanding perfection, exploding in volcanic fury when he found sloppiness or incompetence. He screamed at officers in public, humiliating them before their men. He bypassed the chain of command whenever it suited him, going directly to subordinate units without informing their immediate commanders. He changed orders without consultation, leaving his staff scrambling to keep up with his decisions. He made himself thoroughly despised by the officers who had to work most closely with him. But his men in the ranks, the tank crews and infantrymen and engineers who would actually do the fighting and dying, loved him. They could see that their general was not hiding in some comfortable headquarters far behind the lines while they faced the enemy. He was up front in armored cars and half-tracks, sharing their dangers, eating their rations, sleeping in the same muddy conditions they endured. He drove them hard because he drove himself just as hard. He demanded excellence because he would accept nothing less from himself. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military force ever assembled in human history. More than 3 million soldiers advancing on a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Model's 3rd Panzer Division was assigned to the 24th Panzer Corps, itself part of the 2nd Panzer Group, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, the legendary armor theorist who had revolutionized tank warfare. Model's first combat objective was to capture a crossing over the Bulge River, south of the massive Soviet fortress at Brest-Litovsk. He formed a specialized assault unit of infantry and pioneer engineers, tasked with seizing the Kotin Bridge before the Soviets could destroy it. The assault team captured the bridge intact 20 minutes before the official start of hostilities, a brilliant small unit action that demonstrated Model's emphasis on speed, initiative, and seizing the moment. It set the tone for everything that followed. Guderian urged his divisions forward at breakneck speed, exploiting every gap in the Soviet defenses, bypassing strong points that could be dealt with later, always pushing east. Model proved the perfect subordinate for this style of aggressive warfare. By July 4th, just 12 days into the invasion, his advance elements leading the Panzer Group's charge had reached the Dnieper River, a stunning 250-mile advance through enemy territory. This exploit earned Model the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the prestigious decoration that marked him publicly as one of Germany's outstanding combat leaders. Crossing the Dnieper in strength proved more difficult than reaching it. The Red Army had recovered somewhat from the initial shock of the invasion and was preparing to defend the river line. Model reorganized his division into 3 specialized groups for the crossing operation. An infantry-heavy force would cross first and establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank. A mobile armored group would pass through the bridgehead and continue the advance. A fire support group containing nearly all his artillery would provide covering fire throughout the operation. The plan worked brilliantly, and the river crossing caused almost no casualties. After heavy fighting to expand the bridgehead, Model's division was redirected south to participate in the encirclement of Kiev, the capital of Soviet Ukraine. From late August to mid-September 1941, he conducted a lightning thrust deep into the rear of the Soviet Southwestern Front, an unsupported advance of nearly 200 miles through territory still contested by the enemy. On September 15th, his 3rd Panzer Division linked up with the 16th Panzer Division coming from the south at the town of Lachvitsa, closing the trap around Kiev. More than 660,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in what remains the largest encirclement in military history. Model had driven his men relentlessly throughout this advance, taking enormous risks that would have been considered reckless by more cautious commanders. At one point during the operation, the 3rd Panzer Division had only 10 operational tanks out of its original complement of over 200. But his audacity and his improvisational skills had brought spectacular results. In October 1941, he was promoted to General of Panzer Troops and given command of the 41st Panzer Corps, which was engaged in Operation Typhoon, the final desperate drive on Moscow. The situation when Model arrived at his new command on November 14th was dire beyond anything he had previously experienced. The Corps was exhausted after months of continuous combat. It was stretched thin at the end of impossibly long supply lines that could barely deliver food and ammunition, let alone replacement vehicles and reinforcements. And the Russian winter was beginning to bite with a ferocity that the German soldiers, lacking proper cold weather equipment, were utterly unprepared to face. Temperatures plunged to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Fuel froze in tank engines, rifle bolts jammed with ice. Operation Barbarossa began. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with the largest military force ever assembled in human history. More than 3 million soldiers advancing on a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Model's 3rd Panzer Division was assigned to the 24th Panzer Corps, itself part of the 2nd Panzer Group, commanded by General Heinz Guderian, the legendary armor theorist who had revolutionized tank warfare. Model's first combat objective was to capture a crossing over the Bulge River, south of the massive Soviet fortress at Brest-Litovsk. He formed a specialized assault unit of infantry and pioneer engineers, tasked with seizing the Kotin Bridge before the Soviets could destroy it. The assault team captured the bridge intact 20 minutes before the official start of hostilities, a brilliant small unit action that demonstrated Model's emphasis on speed, initiative, and seizing the moment. It set the tone for everything that followed. Guderian urged his divisions forward at breakneck speed, exploiting every gap in the Soviet defenses, bypassing strong points that could be dealt with later, always pushing east. Model proved the perfect subordinate for this style of aggressive warfare. By July 4th, just 12 days into the invasion, his advance elements leading the Panzer Group's charge had reached the Dnieper River, a stunning 250-mile advance through enemy territory. This exploit earned Model the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the prestigious decoration that marked him publicly as one of Germany's outstanding combat leaders. Crossing the Dnieper in strength proved more difficult than reaching it. The Red Army had recovered somewhat from the initial shock of the invasion and was preparing to defend the river line. Model reorganized his division into 3 specialized groups for the crossing operation. An infantry-heavy force would cross first and establish a bridgehead on the eastern bank. A mobile armored group would pass through the bridgehead and continue the advance. A fire support group containing nearly all his artillery would provide covering fire throughout the operation. The plan worked brilliantly, and the river crossing caused almost no casualties. After heavy fighting to expand the bridgehead, Model's division was redirected south to participate in the encirclement of Kiev, the capital of Soviet Ukraine. From late August to mid-September 1941, he conducted a lightning thrust deep into the rear of the Soviet Southwestern Front, an unsupported advance of nearly 200 miles through territory still contested by the enemy. On September 15th, his 3rd Panzer Division linked up with the 16th Panzer Division coming from the south at the town of Lachvitsa, closing the trap around Kiev. More than 660,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in what remains the largest encirclement in military history. Model had driven his men relentlessly throughout this advance, taking enormous risks that would have been considered reckless by more cautious commanders. At one point during the operation, the 3rd Panzer Division had only 10 operational tanks out of its original complement of over 200. But his audacity and his improvisational skills had brought spectacular results. In October 1941, he was promoted to General of Panzer Troops and given command of the 41st Panzer Corps, which was engaged in Operation Typhoon, the final desperate drive on Moscow. The situation when Model arrived at his new command on November 14th was dire beyond anything he had previously experienced. The Corps was exhausted after months of continuous combat. It was stretched thin at the end of impossibly long supply lines that could barely deliver food and ammunition, let alone replacement vehicles and reinforcements. And the Russian winter was beginning to bite with a ferocity that the German soldiers, lacking proper cold weather equipment, were utterly unprepared to face. Temperatures plunged to 30 and 40 degrees below zero. Fuel froze in tank engines, rifle bolts jammed with ice. Men who fell asleep in their foxholes sometimes never woke up. Despite everything, German forces pushed forward through November and into early December, reaching within 20 miles of Moscow before the offensive finally ground to a halt. The Wehrmacht had shot its bolt. And then on December 5th came the Soviet counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions equipped for winter warfare. Veterans of years of fighting along the Manchurian border with Japan slammed into the exhausted German lines with overwhelming force. Panic threatened to become a rout as German units fell back in disorder through the freezing darkness. Model's response to this crisis revealed the qualities that would make him Hitler's most trusted defensive commander. He was everywhere along his core front, sometimes restoring order at congested crossroads with a drawn pistol in his hand, sometimes personally leading counterattacks against Soviet breakthroughs, always demanding that his men stand and fight. He noticed that Soviet attacks succeeded best against German strong-point defenses, but struggled when faced with continuous lines that could not be flanked. He spread his forces thin, creating an unbroken front while organizing small armored battle groups as mobile reserves to plug any penetrations. His tactics worked. The 41st Panzer Corps held its positions when units on either flank were breaking. By January 1942, with the front stabilizing, Model was placed in command of the entire 9th Army, leapfrogging over at least 15 more senior commanders in Army Group Center. Hitler had noticed him. The Führer appreciated commanders who shared his aggressive instincts and his refusal to surrender ground without a fight. The 9th Army occupied the Rzhev salient, a massive bulge in the German lines that jutted deep into Soviet-held territory northwest of Moscow. The Soviets were determined to eliminate this salient and the threat it posed to their capital. For the next 14 months, Model commanded the defense of this position through some of the bloodiest fighting on the Eastern Front. The Soviets launched offensive after offensive, wave after wave of attacks that crashed against Model's lines. He threw them back every time, counterattacking whenever possible, refusing to cede ground except when absolutely necessary. During this period occurred one of the most famous incidents of Model's career, an incident that cemented his special relationship with Hitler. In January 1942, the Führer telephoned the 9th Army headquarters to interfere with Model's tactical arrangements for an upcoming counterattack. Hitler had become nervous about the threat to the city of Vyazma and ordered that certain units be reserved for its defense rather than used in Model's operation. Model's response was immediate and dramatic. He drove through a raging blizzard from Vyazma back to Vyazma, commandeered an aircraft despite the terrible weather, and flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. Bypassing his immediate superior, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, he demanded a personal meeting with the Führer himself. When he finally stood before Hitler, Model first attempted to lay out his arguments in the formal, logical manner expected of a general staff officer. Hitler was unmoved by logic. Then Model changed tactics. Glaring at Hitler through his monocle, he demanded to know who commanded the 9th Army. Was it Model or was it Hitler? If Hitler wanted to command the army himself, he was welcome to come to the front and do so. Otherwise, Model would make the tactical decisions. Hitler backed down. It was one of the very few times during the entire war that any general successfully challenged Hitler on operational matters and won. Rather than punishing Model for his insolence, the Führer was impressed by his aggression and his willingness to take responsibility for his decisions. The relationship between the two men was cemented by this confrontation. Hitler saw in Model a commander who shared his instinct for the attack, his contempt for defensive-minded generals, his refusal to accept defeat. Model saw in Hitler a political leader who would give him the resources and authority he needed to fight his battles. Through the remainder of 1942 and into 1943, Model continued to command the 9th Army in the Rzhev salient. The fighting was relentless. Soviet offensives came in winter and summer, in good weather and bad. Model's losses were severe, but his defensive skills kept the salient intact when other commanders might have lost it. In the autumn of 1943, after the catastrophic failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk, Hitler complained bitterly to his assembled generals about the declining quality of German troops. What had happened to the fighting spirit of 1941, he demanded? What had happened to the soldiers who had once conquered Europe? Model responded with words that no other general would have dared to speak. "The men of 1941 are dead," he said flatly.
Their graves lie strewn across the whole of Russia.
It was a brutal truth that captured the German army's predicament perfectly. The elite forces that had stormed across the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, the trained veterans who had destroyed army after army in those early months, were largely gone. They had been killed in the fighting around Moscow, around Stalingrad, around Leningrad, in 1,000 unnamed villages and forgotten crossroads. The soldiers now fighting were younger, less trained, facing an enemy that had learned from its early disasters and was growing stronger with every month that passed. Model understood this reality even as he continued to demand the impossible from the men under his command. On March 1, 1944, Model was promoted to Field Marshal, the youngest officer to hold that exalted rank in the German army. He was immediately sent to command Army Group North, which was collapsing under a massive Soviet offensive following the final lifting of the 900-day siege of Leningrad. The situation was catastrophic, but Model stabilized the front through a fighting withdrawal combined with aggressive local counterattacks. He called this approach shield and sword, temporarily giving up ground only to gather reserves for immediate counterstrikes that kept the enemy off balance and prevented the systematic destruction of his forces through the spring and summer of 1944. Hitler shuttled Model from one crisis to another across the vast Eastern Front. He commanded Army Group North Ukraine, then Army Group Center, when that formation was virtually destroyed by the Soviet summer offensive known as Operation Bagration. In each case, his task was the same: stop the collapse, stabilize the front, buy time for a regime that was running out of everything except enemies. In August 1944, Model was sent west to take command of the collapsing Western Front following the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead. He arrived to find the German 7th Army being destroyed in the Ruhr Pocket, trapped between British, Canadian, and American forces that were closing in from all sides. His first order was to defend Falaise to the last man, but within hours he recognized the hopelessness of this and convinced Hitler to authorize an immediate escape attempt. His quick decision saved a significant portion of the trapped forces, though they lost nearly all their heavy equipment and armor in the desperate breakout. Model established his headquarters at a hotel in the peaceful Dutch village of Oosterdijk near Arnhem, where he set about the massive task of rebuilding Army Group B from the shattered remnants of the forces that had fought and died in France. Then, on the morning of September 17, 1944, while eating lunch in the hotel dining room, his meal was interrupted by staff officers pointing at the sky. Aircraft were filling the heavens above the Netherlands. Parachutes were descending by the thousands. Operation Market Garden had begun. The Allies were attempting to capture the bridges over the lower Rhine at Arnhem and the other major rivers of the Netherlands, opening a corridor into Germany's industrial heartland that would bypass the heavily fortified Siegfried Line. By extraordinary coincidence, Model's headquarters was located directly at ground zero of the British airborne drop. He initially thought the paratroopers were mounting a raid specifically to capture him, but he quickly recognized the larger scope of the operation from the sheer scale of the airborne assault. Model's response was immediate and decisive, the kind of quick reaction that had earned him his reputation as Hitler's fireman. He ordered every available German unit into action against the landing zones, including the remnants of 2 SS Panzer divisions that happened to be refitting in the Arnhem area after being mauled in the Normandy fighting. Over the next 9 days, German forces surrounded and systematically destroyed the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Nearly 3/4 of the British paratroopers became casualties. The bridge that would have opened the road to the Ruhr remained firmly in German hands. This victory at Arnhem bought Germany several more months of time, but Model knew it changed nothing fundamental about the war's trajectory. Germany was being crushed between the advancing Soviets in the east, who had already liberated most of Poland and were approaching the borders of the Reich itself, and the Western Allies pressing in from France. Only Hitler's absolute refusal to acknowledge military reality kept the fighting going. In December 1944, Model commanded the forces assigned to the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble to reverse the course of the war in the West. The plan called for German forces to break through the American lines in the Ardennes forest, drive to the vital port of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in two. Model had little faith in the operation from the beginning. When he first saw the plans, he told his staff that they did not have a damned leg to stand on. The resources simply did not exist to achieve such ambitious objectives. He was right. Despite initial successes that caught the Americans by surprise and created a dangerous bulge in their lines, the offensive ground to a halt by late December, stopped by fierce American resistance at places like Bastogne and the inevitable Allied material superiority. American air power, unleashed when the weather finally cleared, devastated the German columns, crowding the narrow roads of the Ardennes. The fuel that German tanks desperately needed never arrived. By January, the offensive had failed completely, and the German forces that had attacked were worse off than before. After the Ardennes disaster, Model's relationship with Hitler deteriorated rapidly. On January 21, 1945, Hitler issued an order stripping Model of direct authority over the divisions in Army Group B, placing them under personal control from Berlin. It was a humiliation that Model accepted without protest, because there was nothing left to do but continue the fighting retreat. Through February and March 1945, American forces closed in on the Rhine, the last major geographic barrier protecting the German heartland. On March 7th, soldiers of the American 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge at Remagen before German engineers could destroy it, establishing the first Allied bridgehead across the Rhine. 2 weeks later, British and American forces crossed in massive strength during Operation Plunder. The defenses that Model had labored to construct were breached. The end was coming fast. On April 1st, Easter Sunday, 1945, American forces completed the encirclement of Army Group B in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Approximately 370,000 German soldiers were trapped in an egg-shaped area roughly 30 miles wide by 75 miles long. Model commanded this force, which included the 5th Panzer Army, the 15th Army, and numerous other formations, along with millions of terrified German civilians who had nowhere to flee. The situation was utterly hopeless by any rational military assessment. Only about half of Model's soldiers had proper infantry weapons. The other half were armed with pistols only, or nothing at all. Fuel and ammunition stocks were nearly exhausted. Allied aircraft controlled the skies absolutely, making any movement in daylight suicidal. Model sent request after request to Berlin, asking for permission either to break out of the pocket or to surrender his forces. Hitler refused both options, demanding that Fortress Ruhr hold out for months and tie down as many Allied divisions as possible. Model knew this was pure fantasy. He had perhaps 3 weeks of food supplies for his troops, and the millions of civilians trapped with them would have to be fed from those same stocks. The Americans were pressing in from all sides, taking city after city, accepting the surrender of thousands of German soldiers every day. Continuing resistance meant only more death, German and American, in fighting that could not change the outcome of the war by a single day. On April 14th, American forces from the 1st and 9th Armies met near the city of Hagen, splitting the pocket in two. The following day, April 15th, Major General Matthew Ridgway of the American 18th Airborne Corps sent Model a message calling upon him to surrender. The message offered honorable terms and pointed out the obvious impossibility of Model's tactical situation. Further resistance was meaningless. Model's response acknowledged that he still considered himself bound by his personal oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler, and that a formal surrender was therefore out of the question. But he had found another way. On April 15, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model issued orders dissolving Army Group B. He discharged the oldest and youngest soldiers from military service entirely, telling them to discard their uniforms and go home. He granted leave to the remaining men, informing them that they could either surrender to the Americans as individuals or attempt to break out through the Allied lines on their own initiative. He simply erased his command from existence, allowing his soldiers to make their own choices about living or dying, rather than ordering them to sacrifice themselves for nothing. It was an act without precedent in German military history. Model had not surrendered, at least not formally. He had not violated his oath to Hitler in any technical sense. He had simply decided that Army Group B no longer existed, that there was nothing left for him to surrender, because he had dissolved it. The men were free. Whatever they chose to do next was their own decision. The next day, April 16th, the bulk of German forces in the pocket began surrendering to American divisions. More than 300,000 soldiers became prisoners of war over the following days, along with more than 20 generals and even an admiral. It was the largest single German surrender on the Western Front, larger even than the disaster at Stalingrad had been. Model himself did not surrender. He could not face that final humiliation, not just because of pride alone, but because of what awaited him. The Soviets had publicly indicted him for war crimes, accusing him of responsibility for more than 500,000 deaths in concentration camps in Latvia and the deportation of hundreds of thousands more as slave labor. Whether these specific charges were accurate remained impossible to determine amid the chaos of the collapsing Reich. But Model knew what Soviet justice looked like for German commanders. Capture meant a show trial and a public execution. For several days after dissolving his command, Model evaded American patrols with a small group of loyal staff officers moving through the forests and ruined towns south of Duisburg. He reportedly made one final attempt to seek death in combat, hoping to fool fighting rather than face capture. But this came to nothing. The fighting was over. There was no one left to fight. On April 21, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model accompanied Colonel Pilling into the forest. They walked together among the ancient oak trees until they reached a small clearing far from any road or building. Model spoke quietly of what remained for a defeated commander, of how the generals of antiquity had taken poison when all was lost. Then he drew his service pistol and shot himself in the head. Pilling buried him where he fell, marking the grave so that it could be found again someday. The forest was silent, except for the distant thunder of American artillery still pounding the last pockets of resistance across the dying Reich. Adolf Hitler outlived his favorite field marshal by 9 days, taking his own life in the bunker beneath Berlin as Soviet soldiers fought their way through the streets above. The 1,000-year Reich that Model had served survived its Führer by barely a week. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Model's grave remained unmarked in that forest for 10 years. In 1955, his son, Hans, who had followed his father into military service and would eventually become a general in the post-war German Bundeswehr, located the site with help from Colonel Pilling. Model's remains were exhumed and reburied with military honors in the Soldatenfriedhof Fossenac, a German military cemetery in the Hürtgen Forest, the same forest where Model's forces had inflicted such devastating casualties on American troops just months before his death. What does the story of Walter Model tell us about duty, about disobedience, about the choices that men face when their world is collapsing around them? Model was no hero in any conventional sense. He served a criminal regime that perpetrated some of the worst atrocities in human history. He drove his men relentlessly, accepting casualties that might have been avoided by a more cautious commander, demanding that they hold impossible positions and launch attacks that cost lives without changing anything. He was brutal to subordinates, foul-mouthed, dismissive of the protocols that governed military courtesy among gentlemen. His staff despised working with him. His peers respected his abilities, while often detesting his personality. Even his nickname among those who served closest to him was unflattering, the front-line pig, earned for his habit of appearing at the most dangerous positions along the line. But in his final act of command, Model made a choice that saved lives. He could have obeyed Hitler's orders to the letter, fighting to the last man in the rubble of the Ruhr, ensuring that tens of thousands more soldiers died, German and American, in battles that could not affect the outcome of the war by a single hour. Instead, he chose dissolution over annihilation. He erased his command rather than destroying it. This was not surrender in any formal sense. Model was too proud for that, too bound by